The second subscription controversy took place in the 1820s, so almost a century after the first, and it was sometimes known as the Arian crisis. And calling it this, of course, meant that emphasis was put on theological difference and on the fears of heresy developing. And while we don't know entirely what the theology of the 18th century non-subscribers was, by the beginning of the 19th century, theology had become a real issue. Now, in the course of the 18th century, the attitude to subscription relaxed, and there were various ways that people were permitted to subscribe. And so the differences between the Presbytery of Antrim and the Synod of Ulster had almost disappeared by this stage, but the two bodies still existed. And in 1818, Montgomery, who was to become the great leader of the non-subscribers, who moved toward the Remonstrants, another group of non-subscribers apart from the Presbytery of Antrim, he was able to be moderator of the Synod of Ulster, and no one was overly concerned about whether or not his theology was as orthodox as the person sitting next to him. And even in 1820, Cook, the great opponent of Montgomery, or the person who was to become his great opponent, and Montgomery were able to sit together. They were both elected to a committee that was set up to try to further missionary activity for Presbyterianism in the south and west of Ireland. And Cook appears at this stage to have been quite relaxed about Montgomery's theology. But then when Smethurst arrived in Ireland, Cook actively campaigned against him. And also there were issues about training of ministry students. Now, in 1814, INST was set up, Belfast Academical Institution. It gained the title Royal a little later when, thanks to William IV, but first of all, it was Belfast Academical Institution, and it had both a school and a collegiate department. And in the collegiate department, young men, it was only young men at that time, of course, could train for ministry and in other subjects and gain the equivalent of the sort of degree that they had previously been going to Scotland for. So they no longer had to travel to Scotland, they could be educated in Belfast. And in the 1820s, Bruce the Younger of First Church was appointed Professor of Biblical Languages at INST. And this rattled Cook because, of course, Bruce was a non-subscriber. And Cook started to agitate in the Synod of Ulster against suspicions of Arianism and against the non-subscribers. At first with very little success, but a new code of discipline was established in 1824. And Montgomery was very pleased by this because it allowed for different forms of subscription. And so the non-subscribers could be quite relaxed. But then in the later 1820s, the tide began to turn and Cook began to garner more support. And in 1828, he successfully campaigned that there should be tests of the orthodoxy of ministerial candidates. This wouldn't apply to people who had already been ordained, but to new ministers coming in. And so if people were coming in and their orthodoxy was suspect, they would not be granted a place. And this would obviously mean that orthodoxy would be ensured for the future. Montgomery couldn't allow this, and he protested, and he and his followers drew together something called a remonstrance, a document that expressed their distaste for what was happening. And eventually it was necessary for the non-subscribers to leave the Synod. One issue that was important here was the appointment of another suspect professor at INST, Professor Ferry. And in fact, the Synod of 1829, which you might expect to have discussed this remonstrance and these difficulties for the non-subscribers, was mainly taken up with discussing Professor Ferry. And so a special synod had to be called, at which the remonstrance was presented. Montgomery may have expected more people to follow him because there were several people in the Synod of Ulster who held less conservative views, but some may have been concerned that their congregations wouldn't have followed them. And at first it wasn't clear how many people would follow Montgomery. Fletcher Blakely and Montgomery were the first two, Montgomery of Dunmurry and Blakely, of course, of Moneyreagh. They were the first two, and ultimately other congregations followed as well. And the Remonstrant Synod held its first meeting in 1830. And it was likened to a great ship a great ship setting out to sea, and in fact parallels were drawn with the Pilgrim Fathers setting off to America. But that ship was going to sail through some turbulent waters. There were difficulties in the 1830s and into the 1840s, but laws passed in the 1840s appeared to give greater security to the non-subscribers. That security, though, was to be short-lived, and before long there was another subscription controversy. And the next thing we'll do is explore some of the reasons underlying that.